You get started. I've got a really good PowerPoint. You can see it up the back there. It's been corrupted, I'm told. Okay, it's officially corrupted, which is good because we're talking about police, so that's kind of a nice starting point. This is all about your rights with police, and we've handed out a few sheets, which is basically a four-stage workshop we're going to do at the end of it, and we'll probably all come together and do, I think, just one workshop, and maybe Steve can be bad cop for the purpose of that workshop. But a lot of people have misconceptions about what rights you have, what rights the police have. A lot of police, I think it'd be fair to say, wouldn't you say, Steve, have misconceptions about their rights.
Especially the police.
Yeah. And in fact, many police have no idea how they should go about exercising the power of arrest, when they should exercise the power of arrest, when they can demand your name. But one good starting point is the police can ask you anything. They can ask you, they have the right to ask you whatever they like. And in fact, it's set out there there's one piece of legislation called the Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act. Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act. Often called...
LEPRA.
Yeah, LEPRA for short. And that's the key piece of legislation in New South Wales that governs, limits and empowers the police in New South Wales, the LEPRA Act, the Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act. Before that, a lot of the police powers were controlled by something called the common law, which is just over time, courts in the UK and Australia have said, well, you know, we've got these things called police, but we have to be really careful with them because we can't have a bunch of uniformed thugs come around and just destroy our civil liberties. That was pretty much the view of the UK courts and the Australian courts. And then they refined it and they said, okay, we've got a police force because remember, police forces haven't been around forever. They're only a creation of like the last 150 years, really. And as we got a more regulated, more commonly accepted police force, what we've actually seen is we've seen that scepticism of the power of police, the dangers of having a well-armed group of people with enormous amounts of power. The scepticism in the population has, I think, in large part, not in Nimbin, but in large part fallen away. We've seen the police assert more and more authority, and we've seen the courts, I think, to a large degree, be less assertive, less likely to force the police to step back. But there are some rights, and they're contained in the Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act. So, first of all, when do you have to give police your name? Well, they can ask you your name at any point. They can stop you on the street and say, please sir, please madam, show me your driver's licence and give me your name. And if you want to, go ahead. Give them your name. But you don't have to. If they've just stopped you, they may have surrounded you with 3 of their friends, they may have a dog there, but they can't just demand your name when you're on the street. Well, they can demand your name, but you don't have to supply your name. And normally if the police are saying, tell me your name and show me your ID, the best thing you can say back to the police is, do I have to? That's a really good question. Do I have to? And then you might get a whole lot of filibuster and bluster from the police. Well, you already got to hide and blah, blah, blah. And just say again, look, officer, are you telling me I'm legally obliged to give you my name and address? And normally they'll back off if they haven't got the power to do it. But there are circumstances where they can compel you to give your name. The first is if you're driving a car, and Steve will tell you.
You have to give your name and your name and address. It's a general rule that has a number of exceptions, as David just said. That's one of the exceptions. The general rule is you don't have to, but that is one of the exceptions. The legislation says you must if you're the driver of a vehicle. Yeah, and the key thing, did you hear Steve just sort of said it very quietly at the end there? If you are the driver of a vehicle. Anyone else in the car, any passenger? No, not so much. The law only applies to the driver of a vehicle or a person suspected of being the driver. So those cases where car gets pulled over, someone doesn't run, cops run after you, 10 seconds later they tackle you. I'm not the driver. Well, I suspect you are because I've just seen you run from the driver's side door. It's a little bit wider, but the driver of a car, generally speaking.
The only additional point I'd say is if you are supervising a learner, well then basically all the laws that apply to drivers apply to you. And actually, as I've come in and out of Nimbin a couple of times, and I've seen a number of cars with like 3 young adults and a learner in it, and I'm thinking that may not be as clever as you think, because all the laws that apply to the learner that apply to a driver apply to whoever the other person in the passenger seat is supervising a learner.
The supervisor, not the backseat passengers though, so you're safe enough in the backseat. Despite your advice, no doubt, about how the driving's going from the backseat. That's your privilege as a backseat driver to do what you want to do.
Yeah, it's a wonderful position, the backseat. You can give whatever advice you like. You're not liable for anything at all. Great. The other occasion they can force you to give your name is if you've been involved in a car accident. That's when they can force you to give your name. And also, if they think that you're a witness of a serious criminal offence. So if you're somewhere and someone has the bejesus beaten out of them, or you've witnessed some very serious criminal offence or serious criminal offence, the police can demand you give your name and address and ID, so as they can identify you as a witness to deal with a very serious crime, a serious indictable offence, I think it's called. Yeah. So you don't have to give them your name. The other occasion that you have to give the police your name is if they actually charge you and arrest you. So if they find you in possession of drugs, that's when you have to give your name, and you have to give your actual address. And it's actually an offence not to give your accurate name and not to give your accurate address at that point. Steve will tell you from practice that if you muck around with the police at that point and you don't give your name, what will happen, Steve?
Usually, the offences are subject to bail conditions. That is, the police have the right to hold you in custody. The purpose of arrest by the police, by way of preface to what I'm about to say, is not to punish you. It's not meant to be what they're meant to do. They're just meant to take you to the court for the judge to decide, the magistrate to decide, have you committed an offence? If so, what punishment do you get? It's often worth remembering that. The police forget that themselves. So many times a day the police forget that. Anyway, so in terms of the police process, they arrest you for the purpose of taking you to court. Many, many times they'll let you go on bail. That is, come back to court on this day, you're on bail in the meantime. If you do not give your name and address, the police are not going to give you bail. Simple. Full stop. Won't even think about it. If they know who you are because they've had dealings with you, fine. But if you just refuse and they don't know who you are, they can't force you, but you don't get released on bail. They then take you to a magistrate. You don't have to tell the magistrate your name and address. But if you don't tell the magistrate your name and address, they won't give you bail either. So you stay in custody until your case comes around, and eventually I think you give your name and address and you go home.
Basically, once you've been charged, if you don't give them your address, they give you a new address, which is the jail cell at the local police. And that's another important distinction. A lot of people think that whenever you're charged by the police with a criminal offence, and that's where the police believe that they've got a good case against you, that maybe you've supplied drugs illegally, or you've stolen something, or you've failed to comply with some social security requirement or whatever, and they charge you with an offence, they don't have to arrest you. And in fact, most of the time, the police should not arrest you at that time. There's a difference between being arrested, which is where you have your liberty taken and you put in a paddy wagon and then a police cell, and being charged with an offence. Because our law says, still, although with some serious limitations, you are innocent until proven guilty. And not proven guilty in the eyes of the police, but proven guilty in the eyes of a court. And so unless there is a good reason, the police should not be arresting you, even when they're charging you with modest offences. And there's a bunch of people who have tested this, and they've been found to have been unlawfully arrested by the police, even when they've been charged. So there is a distinction between being charged and arrested. Most police don't get that.
I agree.
So you've been charged and you've been arrested. Okay, that normally follows in New South Wales, although it shouldn't. Do you have the right to silence? Well, apart from providing your name and address, you do still have the right to silence in New South Wales. And as a lawyer, I don't know, and Steve does a lot more criminal work than I ever did, But the most frustrating thing is you tell people you have the right to silence, don't tell the police anything other than your name and address. Inevitably, when people are surrounded by 3 or 4 police, maybe a drug dog, maybe 5 or 6 police, and the police are peppering you with questions and having a go at you, maybe they're doing it to you in a police, in an interview room in the police station, maybe they're doing it to you as they're arresting you in your car, people just end up talking. And the police are very good at getting people to talk. But the strongest advice I can give you is if you're having interactions with police, don't say anything. If you've been charged or you're in a car, give them your name and address. But apart from that, just simply say, no, thank you, officer, I'm not answering any questions. No, thank you, officer, I'm not answering any questions. And you can say that 50 times. No, thank you, officer, I'm not answering any questions. But more often than not, people end up talking, don't you find, Steve?
Absolutely. Which is why the police keep asking, why the police keep talking to you. It's a key part of the effectiveness of policing from the point of view of getting convictions. Most people who are charged with an offence, I think this is fair to say most, convict themselves by making admissions to the police. That is, in terms of drug offences, they say, yes, that's my stuff. Yeah, that's mine. They make admissions, right? People are over-cooperative. We'll get on to searching and think a bit later, maybe soon, but people agree to allow to be searched, for example. Leave that for a moment more. But in terms of making admissions, conversations, anything you say to the police, it sounds like a movie line or something, everything you say to the police can be used against you in evidence is true. That is, they will come to court if need be. The police will say, asked her what she had in her bag, she said something, yeah, a couple of cookies, leave me alone, they're for medicine. That will be repeated in court, okay? And that probably means some kind of admission that you knew you had possession of cannabis in that particular example.
Or, and I'll get to you in a second, or the police, when you turn up to court and you say, well, it wasn't mine, it was my flatmate's, and and how did you know that? Well, X, Y, and Z, and I'm not suggesting that should be your defence, it's a pretty crap defence. But the police will say, oh, but at the time you said you'd never seen it before. You said you'd never seen it before. And they find inconsistencies with you. The best way not to be inconsistent when you get to court is not to have told them a version when you're frightened and scared and being questioned by police. Simply say, no, thank you, officer, I'm not answering any questions. Rob.
In Australia, do you have the issue of inferences?
Wait for the microphone. The rule here is you have to speak into a microphone, otherwise you won't get heard.
In Australia, if you remain silent, you're now in police custody. Can inferences be drawn from the silence? Because generally they say in Canada that a good citizen should speak to the police officer, and if you're totally silent, then inferences can be drawn on that. Is that the same in Australia?
In Australian law, no. Inferences cannot be drawn. That is, the police, the prosecution cannot come to court and say, we asked him a question, he could have explained it, he could have said something, he could have said he hadn't had a reason for it, he could have told me it was his brother's and not his. He didn't say that. They cannot come. They cannot say you're offered the opportunity and you didn't say anything. It used to be the problem that American TV was the worst problem for practicing lawyers in Australia because so many people got wrong information from American television. These days, English television is just as bad. In the United Kingdom a few years ago introduced a system where they can, in England now, in the UK I think totally, you can now have inferences drawn against you in court. So now the English system is they warn you, police warn you, if you don't answer, if you've got an explanation you give, you don't give, we're going to tell the judge. That's the law of England, it's not the law of Australia.
There is a minor exception to that in New South Wales. The Police Association, I don't know if any of you heard the discussion about the Police Association earlier, but the Police Association want to get rid of the right to silence in New South Wales, and they've been aggressively pushing it. And they had a little watering down of it about 3 years ago. So now it turns out that if you're in a formal interview with police and your solicitor is present, and you don't volunteer something then, when your solicitor is present, and you turn up at court and later say it, well then they can say, oh, but you didn't say it when your solicitor was there, you're making it up. But don't worry, in those circumstances, you'll have a very competent solicitor with you, and they'll take you through all of that. And in some circumstances, the solicitor might say, well, I'm just going to bugger off, and I'm telling you not to say anything to the police. Sometimes that's the best advice.
Going back to English television for a moment, that's why you always see in these later shows that there's a good job for extras probably, someone who has to sit there through the police interview scene, who's the lawyer, who says nothing, but that's the English law. It only works if there's a lawyer present, and the English system now allows for the legal aid system to provide a free lawyer. Australia, there is no legal aid for a lawyer to come to the police station with you. You've got to pay the lawyer, and because of that rule that was brought in a few years ago that David was just talking about, they have introduced that law in New South Wales. The general view of lawyers is that they will refuse to go to the police station with a client because that only opens up the possibility. So most lawyers in Australia will say, no, I'm not going to go, and then the rule doesn't come into effect because you don't have a lawyer with you.
I just want to ask, numerous times this morning you've categorised things by starting the sentence in New South Wales. We're very close to Queensland, and some of us live in Queensland and travel obviously backwards and forwards. Where possible, are you able to make it clear as to if there is any great difference or where there may be a hiccup between what you're telling us and what's actually happening in Queensland? Thank you.
David might comment as well. Unfortunately, there are some differences in law between the different states. I think what we're talking about over Mardi Gras weekend, in totality, applies across the board. That is, prohibitionist laws apply in every state. But the detail changes. The detail of police rights, for example, from New South Wales to Victoria to Queensland to the Northern Territory are a bit different. So when I'm saying in New South Wales, I'm just reminding myself I'm talking about my knowledge of New South Wales law rather than things of general application. So unless you hear it's general, assume it's probably just New South Wales, put it that way.
But you still have the right to silence in Queensland.
Yep.
So if you
Yep.
cross the border, you
That's
still have the right to silence. And I don't know, ignore all of the intricacies, all of those little details that Steve and I have just given you about the right to silence and all of this. There's only one thing I want you to remember. Don't talk to the police unnecessarily. Don't answer their questions. Just basically leave now. Just don't answer their questions is the key thing that you should have when you're dealing with police. Search rights. When can police search you? Well, they could say, excuse me, madam, do you mind if I check what's in your bag? And you go, oh, okay. They can do that,
That's consent. You've said yes. They've asked and you said yes. That's consent.
Yeah. Excuse me, sir, can you just show me what's in that bag there? And people do. They just do it all the time. But you don't have to. And in fact, I would suggest you shouldn't. If the police are just simply walking up to you and saying, can you show me what's in your bag? What have you got there? Where have you been? When did you last smoke drugs? Don't answer them and don't show them because you don't have to. And as a general rule, the police aren't asking you to help you in those circumstances. That's the basic general rule. But they can search you. They can search your person when they have something called reasonable suspicion. So if they reasonably suspect that you're in possession of illegal or stolen property or you've committed an offence, then they can search you. What's reasonable suspicion? Well, whatever a police officer thinks is reasonable.
Before the microphones go to the back, if people who want to make comments or ask questions, we really do need to use the microphone. While the microphone's getting to you, can I just say about the reasonableness? Reasonableness is also judged by the court, and it's a great favourite word of the legal system of all sorts of laws to leave the word reasonable in there. Many, not just in the drug law context, but across the whole range of laws. And effectively, it's a way of the Parliament saying if something is, the judgment about something reasonable is being passed off to a court, case by case by case. So the usual rule of reasonableness is what would an ordinary person in the same position think or do in the same situation you're in? So would it be reasonable for an ordinary person to do the same thing? That's the reasonableness test, but it's never defined. And the point of it not being defined more closely is to allow the courts, case by case, to work out the justice of the case, I suppose, and decide whether it should a particular law should apply or should not apply.
What's our law? Well, in the black community, I'm telling the kids and that, if the cop hassle you, pull your camera out. You pull out your phone. And the first thing the coppers will say to you, you're not allowed to film us. And well, what I say back to them is, we'll let the judge decide that. It's not up to you. See, the police will push whatever bullshit they can on you in the street. If you don't stand and say, well, look, come on now, you're going a bit far. You either arrest me or I'm walking away, or let's take this into a court. I refused to enter into any conversation. I rolled down my window about 2 inches and handed him my licence. The bastard turned around in the street and pulled me up. This random breath testing, yet you only, it's not random at all. They're targeting.
You can film police. Yep. Yep. You can film police. Yeah, and in fact, if you're having an interaction with police on the street and you've got friends with you, get a friend to stand back 3 or 4 metres and film it. But what you can't do, if you've got a friend filming for you, you can't get in the face of police or in any way interfere with the police going about their duties. That's called hindering police. You'll be up on a separate charge. But definitely, take a step back and film the police. And then you'll get sometimes the police saying, turn that bloody thing off, stop filming me. Just simply say, well, I'm sorry, officer, I'm well within my rights. I'm not interfering with what you're doing. I'm just going to film this. Do you have any different views, sir?
No, I agree. The issue is just not being said to be interfering with the execution of the duty. So you've got to just give them a bit of space. There's a little slight complication where, and I know this is complicated stuff. Law is always complicated, sadly. The law of New South Wales still is that you're allowed to film anyone, including police. It's the recording of sound that is made illegal without a warrant. So it's a bit of an awkward situation to talk about in a sense, but strictly speaking, you're not legally entitled to film with, record the sound, the audio of the interaction with the police. However, in a situation where the case goes to court and you want to play the film footage to the judge or the magistrate, you probably do, I'm assuming, even though the sound aspect of the footage is unlawfully obtained, you can ask the court to allow that evidence in, and there's this sort of general court discretion, a bit of leeway. So even if evidence has been improperly or illegally obtained, it might still be allowed to be considered by the court in the circumstances of the case. That's how police get lots of illegal evidence in, illegally obtained evidence in from their side. It can work from a defence point of view as well, but it's just more a technicality to say you have to be aware of that.
I'm a member of Parliament for the Greens, but I'm also a barrister. And the good thing is we've got lawyers, so we're going to argue. I disagree with Steve on that. You're not allowed to tape a private conversation unless you have the consent of the person who's part of a private conversation. But if someone's having a public conversation, speaking in public, there's no sense of privacy to it, well then the Surveillance Device Act I don't think makes it unlawful. But the police will try and tell you it's unlawful. Basically, step back. If it's happening on a public street, it's a public conversation, I think you're entitled to film it and record it. But, you know, the lawyers can argue about these things.
I agree that we disagree. It's good fun to disagree with other lawyers. The third option is to say there was an implied consent. That is that the police knew that you were filming them. They would have assumed that you were recording sound. That didn't say to stop, and therefore they've, by implication, consented to the recording of the sound as well. Anyway, the woman at the front and then the fella in the nice black hat.
So I was just wondering, if an officer does pull you up and searches your person and then decides they're going to just search your bag, can they get in big trouble for that? They haven't asked permission, they haven't gained permission. Can they then get in trouble because that's obtained unlawfully?
All right, so just quickly, I'll just give you the rundown on search powers. If police have reasonable suspicion that you've committed an offence or you have some illegal property on you or like, they can search you. They can pat you down. They can get you to take off your jacket if you're wearing a jacket, or it's called an outer garment. I assume that also includes a jumper or a coat. They can get
hoodie
you to...
if you're a gangster.
Yeah, that's right, or a hoodie. They can look in your mouth, but they're not allowed to poke around in your mouth, but they can say, open your mouth, I want to look in your mouth. But you'll be pleased to know at that stage they can't look at any of your other cavities. They can get you to take off gloves. They can get you to take off a hat. They can ask you to move your hair so they can look inside your hair. They're not allowed to touch your hair themselves. They can get you to take off your shoes and socks, or sandals, or thongs. But that's pretty much, and they can look in your bag. If you've got a backpack with you, or a man bag or something, then they can search in your bag, your backpack. But having formed the view that you might be carrying something on you, they can't then go and search your house ordinarily without a warrant. They can't necessarily search your car unless they have separate reasonable suspicion there's something in your car. So they can get you to take off your jacket, they can look in your bag, get you to take off your hat, get you to take off your shoes and socks, and they can pat you down, and they can actually ask you to empty out your pockets and the like. Did I miss anything, sir?
No, correct. But again, it goes back to the point about consent, because what the interaction will always be, the police will first of all ask, can I search you? Can I look in your pocket? What's in your bag? They'll always ask. So you'll be asked to consent first of all. They won't use that language. They won't say, do you consent? They won't put it that way usually. They'll just say, do you mind? So the best advice, generally speaking, is to say to the officer, no, I do not consent. I'm not going to resist. You know, if you think got reasonable grounds, okay, go ahead. I'm not going to resist, but I do not consent. The reason that's important is if there is something that is wrong about the search, we'll cover that, I think, in a moment or two, David's next point. If there's something that's unreasonable about the search, then they would otherwise not be entitled to search you. Therefore, the evidence might be excluded. They find something that they can't actually take to court, or the judge won't allow to be led into court as evidence, then you're in a better position if you haven't consented. Once you've consented, it doesn't matter. If it's illegally obtained, if there are no rounds, it doesn't matter. You've consented.
So why don't we try this? Why don't we try a group exercise at the moment?
That's always fun.
After the count of 3, please say, no, I do not consent. It's really easy. Try it. 1, 2, 3. No, I do not consent. You see, it's really easy.
Practice,
but
people, practice.
People don't do it. And time after time, they don't do it. So if the police have reasonable suspicion or believe they have reasonable suspicion, they say, I want to search you, can you show me your bag? You say, no, I don't consent. And they say, well, I'm directing you to show me what's in your bag and I'm going to search you. You say, do I have to? You give me a lawful direction, and they will say yes. Then I strongly suggest you cooperate at that point. If they believe they have the power and they tell you they have the power despite you not consenting, cooperate. Because if the exercise of their power was thought by a court to be lawful and you don't cooperate, you get charged with hinder police and a whole lot of nastiness. So say, I don't consent. Are you forcing me to do this? They say yes. I would suggest you comply.
Agreed.
So we have a number of little sort of workshop scenarios. There's a bunch more there that I could go through, but I think we're running out of time. We might go in the workshops.
We're always running out of time. Yep, we're always running out of time.
So have anybody got the workshop scenarios?
Many of the
We'll do a question while people are checking.
We'll get to you.
Oh, okay, sorry, and then we'll go.
So in regards to you saying the consent is determined by whether police feel that they have reasonable suspicion, sorry.
No. Let us stop you there. The consent, there's 2 parts. You can consent.
Yep, so I didn't mean to say consent.
They have reasonable suspicion.
Yep, so is reasonable suspicion if you're driving a car into a festival and you got stopped on the way to a festival and they asked to search your car? If you say no and they still search anyway, and then when it goes to court, they conveniently lost the video recording that's supposed to be on their car, what goes on there? Because that's happened before.
In that situation, the magistrate court, the magistrate would accept that you did not give consent. If you said you didn't give consent and they couldn't find the video, they'd probably assume, because they can't prove beyond reasonable doubt that you did not do it, sort of thing. So that part of it would probably be your version, if I put it that way, would be accepted, that you didn't consent. Then they'd look at whether or not there was reasonableness, and that would be the type of car you're driving, any behaviour of the alleged behaviour of you as the driver. It depends. The cases go every which way. What's reasonable is a case-by-case decision. There have been cases, certainly though, where courts have said it's okay to search vehicles like combis or hippie cars. It's okay on the grounds of the nature of the vehicle, the age, state of repair of the vehicle, and the untidiness of the vehicle in terms of camper vans and so on. That they can. At the festival situation, David's going to talk about sniffer dogs. I'm sure he can't go through for an hour without talking about sniffer dogs. But in the festival setting, being at the festival is not sufficient reason, in my view, to say that that's grounds for search.
Yeah, but you might get a crap magistrate who just says, you look like a hippie, therefore it was okay to be searched. Seriously, it can be as stupid as that. But if you don't consent to the search, and you haven't consented to the search, and you've got a competent lawyer, you've got a good chance of having the evidence thrown out. You won't always get the evidence thrown out, but you've got a much better chance of getting the evidence thrown out and walking away free than if you consented to the search. Because once you consent to the search, you're screwed. Anything they find, they can use against you. But if you don't consent and it ends up being the search was unlawful when it's tested in court, then you've got a much better chance of getting away free. Gentleman in the hat.
Yeah, sorry, just to go back to filming the police, or filming when you're being interviewed or whatever, and you were talking about implied consent, potentially you're filming it so they can just assume that you're filming sound. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was given the information at one point, if you just say, I am filming this with sound, it's public, you know, then if they choose to continue to speak themselves,
Yeah, that's right.
then the consent has been given. If they don't want to give consent, they can't speak any longer.
Look, I agree. In that scenario, if you say, look, I'm filming with the sounds on, and they say nothing, then that's even a stronger argument that you have impliedly given consent to, even if they don't say, yeah, okay, they haven't said no, okay? So that's the main thing. By implication, they agree.
But a public conversation on a public street, there's no prohibition on filming and recording that. Otherwise, you know, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 2 could never go and record things in the public. They're perfectly allowed to record things that happen in public if they're not private conversations.
But I mean, even
And that's-
regardless,
that's-
even if they pulled somebody up on the side of the road or come into their house with a warrant or whatever, you say, I'm going to record this, this isn't a public place, well, I'm recording it, I've told you, so therefore you've given
That's
consent.
Right. That's right.
Or they
That's
don't
right.
have to
That's
talk
right.
to you.
That's
It's their
right.
choice.
We're talking about some grey areas, but yeah, that's right. It's not a bad idea. Just by the way, with a search, the police, with a search warrant of your house, the police will always come along with a team, one of whom will have a video camera which will record most of what the police do during the course of the search as they go through your untidy, probably, bedroom.
Officer Bolt. Officer Bolt. Have you got your script there, Officer Bolt?
Yeah, well, there's that,
Yeah.
that source and that source.
So we've got to go through these. Yeah.
Can't hear, sorry.
But we're going to run out of time to do the scenarios unless we do them now. And I'll be around after to answer any specific questions. So will Steve. Officer Bolt, you're leaving a music festival and you're driving your car. You're pulled over by Officer Bolt, who says to you,
Pull over driver, what's your name and address? There's a script. Pull over driver, got that part right. Where's your driver's licence, mate?
do you have to provide the driver's licence? Yes. The officer then says,
I'm going to ask you to undertake a random breath test. Count to 10
do I count to 10 and comply?
into this.
Yes, because if you don't comply, and this is an alcohol drug test, and you don't comply with that direction, you are deemed, you basically get the same penalty as if you had high range alcohol in your blood system. So always count to 10. Then Officer Bolt says,
Mate, your eyes look a bit red. When's the last time you smoked cannabis?
this is a good time to practice something that we did earlier. Again, what was the question, Officer Bolt?
Your eyes look a bit red, mate. When was the last time you had a smoke of cannabis?
So what do I say? Beautiful, beautiful. Could you say it louder? Yeah. Sorry, I'm not answering any of your questions. Or I'm not answering your questions, officer. Or just don't say anything. If you feel like you can't stick to the script, just say I'm not answering your questions, officer. The officer will then does this.
I'm requiring you to undertake a random drug test. Please provide a sample of your saliva on this plastic stick I'm about to shove in your mouth.
You have to comply. If you don't comply at that point, the penalty you face is the same penalty as if you were found with having either MDMA, ecstasy or cannabis in your mouth. You have to comply. And they swab it around, and then, as a general rule, you wait around about 3 or 5 minutes for the test results.
It'll take 5 minutes before we know the result. You've got to wait here. Don't leave the scene.
And you can't leave, and you have to wait. And then if the drug test is negative, so it comes back and there's the drug test is negative, what will the officer say?
You're right to go, mate. That's all clear.
It's actually not true, though. If it's negative, that's right. You can go, you're all clear. If it comes back positive...
Come with me. You're under arrest. We're going to take you back to the bus or police station, depending on the time, for a further further sample to be taken.
Yeah. Anything...
Leave your car here.
Yeah. So you've got to get out of the car. But did you hear Officer Bolt says you're under arrest? You actually shouldn't be under arrest at that point.
Technically you are, in fact, under legislation.
But they then take you to the Winnebago or that little mobile home that the police have. And what will they do then?
Mr. Shoebridge, we need you to provide another sample of your saliva. Another swab. Yeah. Wait here until we get the results of this test.
Yeah, that's a little quicker. That test, I think, it's not always 5 minutes, but sometimes you can be hanging around for 20, 25 minutes for that.
Yeah. A bit longer sometimes.
So if you were zonked your eyeballs on cocaine at that point, would that test come back negative or positive? It would
You're
come
all
back
clear for
negative.
Shoebridge. Back to the party,
that's right,
sir.
back in the car. If you were zonked your eyeballs on benzodiazepam, that result would come back.
All clear, Mr. Shoebridge. Away you go.
Off you go, drive. But if you had a tiny trace element of cannabis or MDMA or amphetamines in you,
Beep, 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 beep. You are positive. You are not to drive for 24 hours. Here's a notice to that effect. We're going to send this sample down to Sydney. We'll be further advising you about the result of that sample test. You may be required to attend a local court on a date specified in that notice. If you fail to attend court, and it goes on for a bit after that.
just for the record, you should not drive the car while affected by cocaine or benzodiazepines. It's a very bad idea. But the police roadside drug testing won't pick it up at all. And then if you fail that second test, it goes off to a lab. You can't drive for 24 hours. And then you await the lab determination. That can take a couple of months sometimes. And you can drive during those next few months. Although, of course, the police will have recorded your registration number, and they will be looking for you from thereafter, because the police have cameras at the front of their highway patrol cars that pick up everybody's license plate, and then scanning the license plate, they just in real time run them through their database. And if anyone comes up with having previously been stopped for cannabis, bang, you're very likely to be pulled over by the mobile drug test again within those 3 months.
Indeed.
Which is not quite random, is it?
Not quite random.
No. All right.
It should be said the word random is not in the legislation, so
No.
they don't have to be random. It's just a
Yeah.
convenient, if slightly misleading term
It's
that they use.
MDT, malicious drug tests, I think it's called. Or mobile drug tests. Okay,
Not allowed to drive for 24 hours. Well, someone else can drive it. You can arrange for a friend or relative, or someone to go and get it, an enemy if you want to get it for you, or you come back and get it the next day.
Okay, very quickly. I don't think we're going to have time to do all four because it's almost 2
We don't,
o'clock.
no, we won't.
You're at a protest. You're at the front of a peaceful protest supporting something like the legalisation of cannabis. The protest is marching down the main street of town, and Constable Bolt stops and tells you the march is not authorised.
This march is not authorised. This is a bit misleading because, in fact, we're not authorised, are we? We don't care and we won't be stopped. However, we'll just say that in passing. This march is not authorised. You don't have a permit. Are you the organiser, Mr. Shoebridge?
Well, first of all, you don't have to answer that question. But one thing we didn't cover in this is you have the right to protest in New South Wales. You don't have to seek the permission of the New South Wales Police to have a good old protest anywhere you like in New South Wales. If you want to block a street off, though, and you're going to block off an entire footpath, well, then there's a process you can go through to tell the police you're going to have a protest. You've got to give them 7 days' notice, and I'm going to be blocking the street or I'm going to be blocking the footpath. And then if the police don't go to court to stop you, and the police don't go to the Supreme Court to get an order to stop you, you're actually allowed to block the street and block the footpath and block the traffic. So just again, if you just want to have a protest in a public park somewhere, go for your life. You don't need the permission of the police. If you want to have a protest out the front of some politician's office, provided you're letting people walk up back and forth along the footpath, go for your life. You don't need the permission of the police. All right? But if your protest is going to shut down a street, well then the police can charge the organiser of that protest with traffic offences unless you've given them 7 days' notice. And you put a form in, it's quite straightforward. You say, I'm going to be holding a big legalised cannabis rally out in May in Nimbin between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, and I'm going to be shutting down the street. And then you're allowed to shut down the street and they can't charge you with a traffic offence. But let's be clear, despite the government's best efforts, you still have the right to protest in New South Wales.
Yay for that. Yay for that. No, that's exactly right. So if in that scenario where you are marching for rights of various sorts, of any sort, you're entitled to march. If the police say you've got to get off the road and you don't have a permit, then that's where it gets interesting. You either do or you don't leave the roadway. It won't happen. Don't be alarmed about this conversation. Nothing like this will eventuate today at the Mardi Gras March and Rally because everything is so law-abiding here. We never break any laws in Nimbin and the police know that, so we're all cool.
And I think you're covered by a Form 1 anyhow. But there is one complication that I'll say this. Last year, the coalition government passed laws to allow the police to actually make protests unlawful. So once you start it off and it's all going fine, it's all lawful, but the police now have the power, if they think in their own mind that there's a public safety issue at the rally, and heaven knows what that is, what a public safety issue at a rally is. Maybe you're blocking the street, or maybe there's just a lot of you. If they think that there's a public safety issue, they can issue you, they'll get it on a loud hailer, or they'll yell at it, and they'll say, we believe that there's a public safety issue here, you all must disperse. You have to get off the roadway. And because the laws that were passed in 2016, if you don't comply with that, then you can be committing an offence. It's not a particularly serious offence. You can be fined about $220, but it's but they can then start arresting you and pulling you off the street. That was laws courtesy of Mike Baird at the time in order to do a favour for the mining industry.
Yeah, the good old days of Mike Baird. It just gets better and better and better.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on protest, if the thing you're protesting is a mining operation or a coal seam gas operation,
We do a bit of that.
well then the laws changed again last year.
That's right.
And this is something we spoke about passionately in Parliament. We even got Labor on board on this bit of it. If you are protesting against coal mine or coal seam gas or mining operations in
Which
New
you
South
should
Wales,
do.
which you should do, and you're found to be hindering the operation of a coal mine or a coal seam gas operation, and that
Which
could be
you also should do.
yeah, then you can face up to 7 years in jail. 7 years in jail. So
Dangerous times, my friends, dangerous times.
that's a nice thing to finish on. Last question.
Just a question about the judiciary. Just a question about the judiciary, the courts. Are they implementing the full penalties, or where's that kind of sit amongst all this?
Yeah, so if you're a knitting nana sitting in front of a tractor going into a coal seam gas operation, is a judge going to put you in jail for 7 years? No, not unless you've got a rap sheet, 5 miles long, and it turns out that as well as being a knitting nana, you have a very long history of organised crime. If it's your first offence and you have a very good reason why you're there and you're there in a public interest kind of thing, the courts will take that into account. But let's be clear, the maximum penalty is 7 years in jail. And if you're convicted of an offence with a maximum penalty of 7 years in jail, you want to get some very serious legal advice. Steve?
I agree. It's the kind of charge you wouldn't take lightly. You want to make sure you're properly organised. But I agree with David. You'd be very unlikely to do jail time in that situation. But the penalty is serious. The general rule about maximum penalties doesn't mean you have to do that time or anything. It's just a bit of a guideline to the court about how serious a case is, primarily. That's the main practical effect of the maximum penalties. You don't get a maximum penalty if you're your fourth or fifth offence of the same charge. You may not get the maximum penalty still, but it's a guideline. Sometimes you do get maximum penalties applied to you, but it's more an indicator of how serious. A magistrate would read that as being, a serious offence, 7 years, better give you a good behaviour bond. You're not going to get off with just a fine. You're on a good behaviour bond now. It can be a more serious penalty. Good behaviour bond can be a nuisance in terms of further protesting, for example, for the next 12 months. Those kind of things can escalate. That's the drama.
But the real purpose of changing that law wasn't necessarily to put knitting nanas in jail. When I said again, you've got maximum 7 years in jail for hindering a mining or coal seam gas operation, there was a kind of sense of anxiety in the room. That was the purpose of that change in the law, to try and frighten people not to protest. And we cannot bow down to that kind of crap. Bev Smiles, a Greens member for the Hunter Valley, is actually facing one of the first charge under this Act. She'll be going to court, first court appearance next week. And I can tell you she's going to have lots and lots of friends at court. Myself included.
Everything is connected. Everything is connected. Our rights, our freedom to smoke a joint if you feel like smoking a joint, our ability to have some clean air to live in, a clean environment, clean air, clean water, all of it's connected. All is about us asserting our rights to these things. It doesn't get given to us. But right now, we're about to have a rally, a march, right now. So thanks very much for coming to this discussion. Please, everybody, join in the march, join in the rally, do what we can for cannabis law reform. Talk to people, talk to your friends, talk to politicians. Talk, do more than talk. Act. Well done, everyone.